Episode 9. Someone Had to Sign. Nell Harrow. If you've never stood in a warehouse at night with a dead child, your ex-husband, and a pen that wants a signature more than most living people want love, I don't recommend it. The shutter kept rising, slowly, mechanically. No drama in it. No theatrical reveal, just steel slats rolling up into darkness that should have ended at a loading bay wall and didn't. The opening beyond was too deep, too clean, not ruin, not void. Something arranged, a route, a place prepared to receive what the house no longer wished to hold. David stood under the single light with the red cord biting into his wrist, his marked hand flexing once against it like it had its own pulse now. The black fountain pen sat on the workbench beside the current premises register, as if it had always belonged there. Ordinary object. Ordinary desk item. That was the trouble with this thing, always. It never needed spectacle. It only ever needed process. Margaret did not take her eyes off Thomas. Neither did I. He looked about 8. Blue pajamas, bare feet, hair lying flat as if someone had tried to smooth him down after sleep. No water damage, no grave dirt. No cinematic kindness to make him easier to read. Just a child standing in the center lane of a warehouse that had become a threshold because adults had once made a decision and then spent years pretending decisions don't breed. He had said it plainly. If he signs here, the business lives. And the house can close. That was the offer. Not rescue, not forgiveness. Transfer. A cleaner site. Better systems. Modern continuity. Move the account into the business and the old house, with its sealed room, its bad records, its accumulated corrections and family lies, could finally shut. I knew enough by then to hear what wasn't being said. A house can close. That doesn't mean a debt disappears, it means it moves somewhere easier to manage. David said without looking at me, "How literal is it?" Margaret answered him in the same tone. "Very." He gave one short nod. "If I sign, what happens to the business?" Margaret's mouth tightened. "It becomes active." "In English?" "In English. Your company stops being a company in the ordinary sense." The tannoy gave a soft crackle overhead, as if pleased to be included. Margaret ignored it. Sites begin to connect where they shouldn't. Access points stop behaving properly. Engineers attend call-outs that were never booked. Properties with the wrong history find their way onto your system. The dead use process because process is what you've offered them. David looked at the pen. "And the house?" Margaret paused. That pause told me everything. I said, "Say it properly." She looked at the half-open shutter, then at Thomas. "The house closes." "No," I said, "properly." Her jaw shifted once. The house stops being the primary seat. There it was. Not ended, not cleansed, demoted, like an office branch, like a records site moved after a merger. I laughed once, no humour in it. "So all this does is relocate the problem into payroll and site visits," David said. "And customer properties." "Yes," Margaret said. The pen remained where it was, waiting. Thomas looked at David. Not me. That was the worst part. He wasn't trying to frighten us. He wasn't even trying to persuade. He was simply positioned where the process had placed him, as if childhood had been stripped out of him and only function remained. "You left it open," he said again. This time he was speaking to Margaret. She closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them, she looked older. "I know." David turned to her. "What exactly did you leave open?" The warehouse lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere metal clicked as the shutter reached 3/4 height. The darkness beyond it stayed wrong. Not empty, not full, just available. Margaret took a breath. "When Thomas died, Helen wanted the transfer completed." No one spoke. She went on because there was nowhere left to hide. "The first attempt failed. Your father interrupted it. Thomas was returned, but not properly. He came back carrying process, not memory. Not himself. Process." Thomas did not react. I did. A pressure started behind my eyes. Not tears. Something meaner. Margaret kept going. Eliza refused a second attempt. She said no more children, no more corrections, no more bargains. Helen said refusal would leave the account open. David said, so you closed it another way. Margaret looked at him. No, I delayed it. That word landed like a blade. Of course, not solved, delayed, always delayed. I said, how? She looked at me then, and for the first time all night there was no authority in her face, only guilt and the practical exhaustion of someone who had made one terrible decision and then built a life around calling it necessary. I moved the burden off the house for one night. I stared at her. How? No answer. Then I understood before she said it, because once you know the shape of a family lie, you can usually find the child buried under it. You used us. Margaret said nothing. That was answer enough. I stepped toward her, not far, just enough. Elise and me. Her voice was low. Yes. The warehouse seemed to narrow around us. The central aisle, the tape lines, the workbench, the pen. All of it suddenly smaller than the fact itself. I said, that night, Margaret nodded once, you were both marked as temporary witness and threshold. I could hear my own breathing now. Controlled. Too controlled. That's why Elise remembers the room. Yes. That's why I see the mark. Yes. That's why none of this ever stopped. Margaret didn't answer. Thomas did. Because it was never finished. I looked at him. He looked back with the flat patience of a clerk waiting for someone to sign the bottom page. Not cruel. Worse. Certain. David spoke into the silence. So this is the choice. Margaret said nothing. He looked at the pen. If I sign, the house stops being primary. Yes. And if I don't? This time Thomas answered. It stays where it started, I said. And what does that mean now? Thomas turned his head toward the darkness beyond the shutter. The house keeps trying. There was a child's rhythm in the sentence. That was the only trace of him left. The cadence, the smallness of it. Margaret said, if the house remains primary, it won't stop at the house. I looked at her. What? It's already spread to the hotel. It's already entered the business. If denied formal transfer, it will continue by overflow, pressure, and misfiling. David gave a short, disbelieving breath. So either I sign and poison the company properly, or I refuse and let it keep leaking into everything. Yes, Margaret said. Those are the options? No, I said. They both looked at me. No, those are the options it wants us to see. Thomas watched me. The tannoy crackled once, softly, as if listening. I looked at the workbench, the current premises register, the pen, the task lamp, then at the half-open shutter and the darkness beyond. Then back to Thomas. You said he has to take the cost. Thomas nodded. Yes. Not the code, not the register, the cost. Yes. I thought about the language. Not transfer, not authority. Cost. That meant something older than the business form. Older than the office adaptation. Older, probably, than Helen's cardigan and her smug little desk. Margaret saw it happen in my face. What? I didn't answer immediately, because I hated the idea as soon as it formed. I said, what if the signature isn't the point? David looked at me. It rather looks like the point. No, the signature authorizes the move, but Thomas didn't say he had to take the transfer. He said he had to take the cost. Margaret went very still. The good kind of still. The dangerous kind. I looked at her. What does the cost actually consist of? She didn't answer. I stepped closer. Margaret. Her eyes flicked once to Thomas, then to the shutter, then to David's bound hand, and finally to me. When a site closes, she said quietly, something has to hold the unresolved names. There it was. The real thing. Not energy. Not evil. Not some vague, haunting nonsense for people who like candles and podcasts with too much music under the talking. Names. Records, the dead not as apparitions but as unfinished entries. I said, a ledger. Margaret nodded. Yes. David looked from one of us to the other. And if I sign? Margaret answered, the business becomes the ledger. Silence. Then he laughed once, a hard, stunned sound. My God. No one corrected him. I looked at Thomas. And if he takes the cost without signing? Thomas did not answer. For the first time since we'd entered the warehouse, he looked uncertain. Small, young, not free exactly, but less fixed. The tannoy crackled sharply overhead. Review signatory pending. Delay incurs charge. Good. That meant we were near something true, I said louder now, to the warehouse, to the shutter, to whatever administrative carrion had nested itself in our family and learned to wear office language. Then itemize it. The lights flickered. Margaret turned to me fast. Nell. No. If it wants cost, it can state cost. The tannoy hissed. The half-open shutter shuddered once on its track. Thomas took one step backward into the centre lane, and the darkness beyond the threshold began, very slowly, to fill with shelves. The shelves formed slowly, not rising from the floor, not dropping from the ceiling, just becoming visible in the dark beyond the shutter the way details emerge in weak light when your eyes finally stop lying to you. Metal shelving, grey, industrial, neat rows running back further than the loading bay wall had any right to allow. Archive shelving, not storage racking. Built for files, boxes, ledgers, and the sort of paper that survives longer than affection. The task lamp on the workbench dimmed. The light over David sharpened. The warehouse had made its decision about what mattered. The tannoy crackled once, then the same male voice returned, tired, formal, and entirely without pity. Charge requested, it said. Itemization available. I said, good. My mouth was dry enough that the word nearly stuck. Margaret looked at me as if I'd kicked open a door she'd spent 30 years bracing shut. Nell. No. I didn't raise my voice, didn't need to. No more hints, no more family edits. If it wants paying, it can tell us what it thinks we owe. David was still staring into the shelves beyond the shutter. His bound hand had gone still now, which I distrusted more than the pulling. Thomas stood in the centre lane with his head slightly bowed, as if listening to instructions through a wire none of us could see. The tannoy gave a soft click. Then, one by one, labels appeared on the front edges of the shelves in the dark. Not glowing and not theatrical, typed, white tabs in metal holders. OMANT, Harrow, Vale, deferred, unresolved, returned, corrected. Failed transfer. I felt David go rigid beside me at that last one. I said, Thomas. He looked at me. Is that where you are? He didn't answer. Didn't need to. The answer was 3 shelves in and alphabetized. Margaret made a sound then. Very small. The sort of sound people make when grief has been packed down so long it comes out as irritation with the world for still existing. The male voice said, closure of original site requires assumption of standing charges, deferred names, and correction residue. David said, in English. The voice continued as if he hadn't spoken. Current signatory may accept transfer of active ledger, including all attached entries not lawfully discharged. I said, still not English. Margaret answered this time. If you sign, you don't just take the house. Her eyes were on the shelves. You take everything the house has been forced to hold. David looked at her. Everything? Yes. I said, list it. The tannoy clicked. A printer somewhere in the warehouse started up. Not upstairs this time. Close, too close. We turned. On the packing bench near the roller shutter, a small label printer had come to life by itself, feeding out a strip of white adhesive labels one after another, each one printed in clean black capitals. Thomas Omant, returned/not received. Eliza Omant, unauthorized deferral. Margaret Vale, temporary diversion. Eleanor Omant, witness assignment, child. Elise Omant, threshold assignment, child. I couldn't move for a second. Not because I didn't understand, because I did. The labels kept coming. David Harrow, review signatory, re-entered. Helen Vale, administrative continuity after death. Site, family house, primary seat/compromised. Site, hotel, overflow/unstable. Site, HVP, security shutters. Transfer, pending. The little printer whirred and spat and whirred again like it was only doing stock control. I walked to it before anyone could stop me and tore the strip free. The adhesive labels hung from my hand like a butcher's receipt. I read them again, slower. Eleanor Omant, witness assignment, child. Elise Omant, threshold assignment, child. I looked at Margaret. She didn't defend herself. That was the nearest thing to honesty she'd managed all night. David said very quietly, "You used children as a holding measure." Margaret answered in the same tone. "For one night." I turned on her. "One night?" My voice cracked hard enough to surprise me. "One night?" Thomas flinched. "Not much." "Enough," Margaret said. "I thought if I could move the pressure long enough." "You thought wrong." "Yes," she said. No argument. No excuse. Just yes. That made it worse. The tannoy said temporary diversion created residual liability. I laughed then, a short, ugly sound. Of course it did. Because that was the shape of all of it, wasn't it? Every act of love in this family eventually reclassified as administrative error. David held out his clean hand. "Let me see those." I gave him the labels. He read them once, jaw tightening more with each line. Then he stopped at Thomas's. Returned/not received. He looked up. "What does that mean?" No one answered. He asked again, sharper. "What does that mean?" Thomas did. It came out in the voice of a child repeating something adults had said over him. "It means I came back and nobody took me." The warehouse went dead still. Even the buzzing lights seemed to draw back. I looked at him. He was still in blue pajamas, still barefoot, still 8, and suddenly I could see it. Not memory, not exactly, but the shape of the thing. A child returned wrong. A mother refusing him because refusal was the only mercy left. A grandmother trying to delay the system by moving the pressure onto the surviving girls. A dead administrator calling it procedure. And a house forced to keep the record open because no one had ever lawfully received the name. Margaret said, barely above a whisper, "Eliza couldn't." Thomas looked at her. "I know. That nearly finished me, not anger. That small, impossible kindness from the child. We had all failed." David looked back at the label in his hand. "So if I sign, all of this comes into the business?" "Yes," Margaret said. "The names, the residue, the failed transfer." Thomas. "Yes. And if I don't?" Margaret looked toward the shelves beyond the shutter. "It remains distributed. House, hotel, business. Anywhere it can find continuity." I said, "What counts as lawful discharge?" No one answered immediately. Then the male voice on the tannoy said, "Receipt, naming, placement, cost accepted without diversion." Margaret closed her eyes and I said, "There, that." David looked at me. "What does that mean?" I was already thinking through it. "Receipt means someone has to acknowledge the returned name." Margaret opened her eyes. "Yes." "Naming means properly recording what happened." "Yes." "Placement means what? Burial? Record? Site?" Margaret hesitated. "Proper resting place. Proper record. Proper relation." I looked at Thomas. He was watching me now. Not the board, not David, not the shutter. "Me," I said. "And cost accepted without diversion means no moving it onto children, marriages, hotels, or businesses." Margaret's face tightened. "Yes." David gave a disbelieving breath. So the answer was to tell the truth. No one spoke. Because yes. Of course yes. The answer had probably always been to tell the truth, and because we were this family, we had instead built architecture. The tannoy crackled. "Truth alone does not discharge standing cost." I looked up. Then what does? The answer came at once. Named recipient. That landed badly. I felt David tense beside me. Margaret went pale, and I said, No. The voice continued. Returned minor remains unreceived. Account remains active until lawful recipient accepts placement. Thomas had gone very still. Too still. I looked at him. What does that mean? He answered in his own voice. It means someone has to say I'm theirs. No one moved. Not me, not David, not Margaret. Because we all understood at once what the office was doing. It was taking the oldest wound in the room and reducing it to a signature problem. A child had died. A child had been brought back wrong. A mother had refused him because taking him in that state would have completed something unforgivable. And now the system wanted a recipient, a named relation, a lawful acceptance. Not because it loved order, because order is how cruelty survives long enough to call itself necessity. Margaret said, Eliza was his mother. Thomas looked at her. She's dead. Margaret's mouth shut. Yes, there it was. No mother left to receive him. No lawful closure, only the surviving line. I said, No. Thomas took one small step toward me, not threatening, not pleading, just nearer. Your witness! I shook my head. No. He looked at David, then him. David said instantly, Absolutely not. The tannoy clicked. Review signatory may accept on behalf of continuity structure. I said, Stop calling him that. The voice ignored me. Acceptance permits closure of original site and transfer of standing ledger. David looked at me then. Really looked. And I knew what he was thinking because I was thinking it too. If he accepted Thomas, even without signing the business transfer, the office might still use him as continuity. Different route. Same trap. I said it aloud. If you receive Thomas, they'll count you. Margaret nodded once. Yes. David looked at Thomas, then at the pen, then at the shutter, then at me. So what's left? That was the question, wasn't it? After all the secrets, all the architecture, all the substitutions and diversions and marriages and sealed rooms and business sites and hotel overflow. What was left when the system had narrowed everything down to a child no one had properly received? I looked at Thomas, really looked, at the bare feet, the pyjamas, the patient, administrative stillness laid over something that had once been a little boy. And then I saw it. Not in him, in the labels, in the wording. Return/not received, not buried, not named, not received, returned. I said slowly, You're assuming he came back to the house? Margaret frowned. What? I took the labels from David and held up Thomas's line. Returned to where? The warehouse lights flickered. Thomas blinked. The tannoy did not answer. Good. I stepped toward the shutter. Margaret said sharply, Nell. I ignored her. Return to where? I said again, louder now, to the shelves, the shutter, the voice, the whole rotten office mechanism. To the room? To the family? To the site? Or to the person who called him back? Silence. Then the half-open shutter gave a violent metallic shudder. The lights over the site board blew out. The task lamp flared white, and from somewhere upstairs through the floorboards of the office above us, Helen Vale began to laugh. Helen's laugh came through the ceiling first, thin at the edges, dry, not joy, never joy. Just the sound of a woman hearing someone finally ask the right question and hating that they got there without her permission. The warehouse held still around us. The shutter remained half open. The shelves beyond it no longer looked like archive storage. They looked attentive, waiting to see which version of the record would survive. I kept my eyes on the dark beyond the threshold. Returned to whom? No answer. Then the tannoy clicked, and the male voice, tired, formal, increasingly irritated now, said, Original receiving party unavailable. I smiled without humour. There we are. Margaret said, Nell, no, let it answer. David had gone quiet beside me in the way he always did when a structure started showing its joins. He was frightened, yes, but underneath that I could feel him working, sorting, testing language, looking for liability. Good. I needed that version of him, I said louder now. If the original receiving party is unavailable, then the account has been misdirected. The lights flickered once. Thomas looked up sharply. The tannoy did not speak. That was as good as a confession. Margaret stared at me. What are you doing? Reading the wording. She gave a short, angry breath. This is not a contract dispute. No, I said, it's worse. It's a family one. Then I looked toward the ceiling. Helen! For a moment there was nothing. Then her voice came, not through the tannoy this time, but down the stairwell, carrying from the admin office above with that same dry, clipped authority she'd worn in life and death alike. You always were your mother's daughter when cornered. I turned. She stood at the top of the warehouse stairs, one hand resting lightly on the rail, cardigan neat, expression composed. She might have been about to ask why the monthly figures were late. Only her eyes gave her away. Too bright, too fixed, too pleased with suffering to belong to the living. Margaret said, "Stay where you are." Helen looked down at her. "Margaret, if I intended to come down there, I'd already be behind you." "Fair. Unpleasant, but fair." I said, "Who called Thomas back?" Helen's gaze shifted to me. "He was not called back. Don't lie." A pause. Then that tiny, bloodless smile. "He was processed back." I felt David tense beside me. I said, "By whom?" Helen did not answer immediately. Instead, she descended one step, then another. Not enough to join us, just enough to make herself part of the room. "The first transfer failed," she said. "The child crossed, but not cleanly. There was panic, interference, refusal. The account could not close with an unnamed minor in motion. Thomas had not moved. Not once." I said, "That's not an answer." Helen's eyes stayed on mine. "No, it's the part you keep trying not to understand." I took one step toward the stairs. "Try me." Margaret said my name sharply. I ignored her. Helen folded her hands. The house did not return him. The family did not return him. The office did not return him in the way you mean. David said, "Then who did?" Helen looked at him as if mildly surprised he was still contributing. "The threshold did." Silence. Then Margaret swore. Not loudly, not theatrically, just once under her breath, like a woman hearing an old nightmare confirm itself. I looked at her. "What does that mean?" She didn't answer. Helen did. "It means the child was brought back through the active threshold point created during the transfer attempt." I said, "That's still evasion." Helen's smile vanished. "Very well." The room returned him. The warehouse seemed to contract around that sentence. The half-open shutter gave a low mechanical groan. Thomas lowered his head. I said, "No." Helen looked almost bored. "Yes." "No. Rooms don't return children." "No," she said, "but thresholds do. If opened improperly, if interrupted, if asked to carry what they were not built to carry." David said, "Asked by whom?" Helen turned her head slightly toward Margaret. There it was. Margaret went white. I looked at her. "What did you do?" She stared at Helen with open hatred. Helen said softly now, because cruelty always gets quieter when it knows it has landed. "Margaret asked for time." I felt something cold move through me. Not shock. Recognition. Of course she had. Not for power, not for knowledge, not for some occult thrill, for time, for one more night, one more chance, one more impossible reprieve from a child dying in a room built to turn family into paperwork. I said, "You asked the threshold to hold him." Margaret's eyes filled, though no tears fell. "Yes," the word barely made it out. David looked at her as if he'd never seen her before. "And it gave him back wrong." Margaret shut her eyes. "Yes." Helen said, "Because thresholds are not cradles." That nearly made me hit her. I said, "So Thomas wasn't returned to the house?" "No. Or to Eliza." No. Or to the family? Helen tilted her head. Not initially. That mattered. I felt it. The shape of it settling. I looked at Thomas. He was still standing in the centre lane, but something about him had changed. Not softer, not freer, just less certain in the edges, as if the role laid over him had loosened by half a turn. I said carefully now. He was returned to the threshold. No one spoke. Then the tannoy clicked once, sharply, like a microphone catching breath. Good. I stepped closer to the shutter. Nell, Margaret said, be quiet. I kept my eyes on Thomas. Not to the house, not to the mother, not to the bloodline, to the threshold point created in the room. That's why the account never settled. You've been trying to assign a recipient to a return that was never made to a person. Helen's expression hardened. That distinction is administrative. Yes, I said, exactly. David gave a short breath beside me. He'd got it too. I went on. You've spent years trying to force family acceptance for something that was returned to a site. The lights over the workbench flickered. The pen rolled once across the wood and stopped. Helen descended one more step. Sites require custodians. Not always. Always, she said. No, I said. Only if you want continuity. That hit. I saw it in her face, a tiny fracture. There. The thing she couldn't say plainly because it would expose the whole mechanism. This wasn't about necessity. It was about continuity. The office wanted a living structure to keep the process going. Family, hotel, business. It didn't matter which, so long as something living agreed to hold the pattern. I said, if Thomas was returned to the threshold, then the threshold can be closed without transfer. Margaret stared at me. David turned fully now. What? Helen's voice sharpened. No. I looked up at her. That was the first honest answer she'd given all night. I said, yes. Margaret found her voice first. No, Nell. If you close an active threshold with unresolved return inside, it doesn't transfer, I said. It collapses the route. David said, what happens to Thomas? No one answered immediately, because that was the question underneath all the others. Not the site, not the business, not the house, the boy. Thomas looked at me. For the first time since the warehouse became a process map, he looked like a child. Not fully, but enough. I'm tired, he said. That was all. Not help me, not save me, not Mum, just, I'm tired. Margaret made a broken sound. Helen did not move. I said, if the threshold closes properly, what happens to him? Helen's answer came flat and immediate. He goes where he should have gone. I looked at her. And you lose continuity. There it was again. That tiny pause. That tiny hatred. Enough. David said, so that's it. No one looked at him. He stepped forward anyway, into the edge of the light, red cord still tight around his wrist. You don't care where he goes, he said to Helen. You care whether the system survives. Helen regarded him coolly. Systems survive because sentiment does not. David actually laughed. A hard, ugly sound. I work in insurance. Don't try that line on me. Systems survive because people keep feeding them. That was good. That was very good. Helen's gaze shifted to his bound hand. And yet here you are, still structurally useful. He ignored it. Can the threshold be closed without a signatory? Helen said nothing. I said, answer him. The tannoy clicked. Then the male voice returned, but weaker now, less certain, as if the wording itself had begun to shake. Active threshold may be sealed by witness declaration and correct naming of failed return. Margaret inhaled sharply. David looked at me. I looked at Thomas, and suddenly the whole warehouse rearranged itself in my head, not physically, structurally. The witness, the failed return, the threshold point. No signatory needed if continuity was abandoned. No business transfer, no living ledger, just naming, witnessing, closure. The oldest thing in the room, I said quietly. That's why it wanted David. Margaret nodded once, dazed. Yes. Because a signatory keeps the system alive? Yes. And a witness ends it? Helen said. A witness records it. I looked up at her. No. Tonight, I think a witness finishes it. The half-open shutter shuddered again. The shelves beyond it blurred at the edges. Thomas took one small step out of the centre lane. Toward me, and upstairs, somewhere in the admin office, every printer in the building began to run at once. The printers started upstairs and spread through the building like rain hitting different roofs. Admin first, then reception, then somewhere deeper in the warehouse office. Single sheets, continuous feed, label stock, old laser trays dragging paper through hot rollers with that dry, relentless office sound that always makes you feel something official is happening, whether you want it to or not. The whole site had begun producing record. Helen didn't smile this time. That was how I knew we were close enough to hurt her. Thomas had stepped out of the centre lane. Only half a pace, but it mattered. The warehouse noticed too. The light above David flickered. The task lamp over the workbench flared and dimmed. The half-open shutter gave a low shudder, as if the threshold behind it had shifted weight. Margaret said very quietly, "If you're going to do it properly." I didn't look at her. I know. David said, "What exactly are you doing?" Witness declaration. In English. In English, I'm going to tell the truth in the right order and hope the dead still respect procedure. He gave a short, humourless breath. Comforting. No, I said. Not really. Another printer kicked in above us, then another, paper beginning to spill somewhere onto carpet, onto desks, onto floors, the building vomiting its own minutes. Helen took one step down the stairs. "Eleanor, be careful!" I looked up at her. That nearly made me laugh. "Now you're worried." "I'm practical." "No," I said, "you're cornered." The dryness left her face then, not all at once. Just enough for the woman underneath the administrator to show through, tired, furious, and deeply offended that the machinery she'd served for so long might be stopped by someone she considered emotionally undisciplined. She said, "If you close the threshold without transfer, you don't know what else you close with it." Margaret answered before I could. "Yes, we do." Helen looked at her. "Do you?" Margaret held her gaze. "For once, yes." That shut the room for a second. I stepped toward the shutter. The darkness beyond it had changed again. The shelves were still there but less solid now, as if they were being held in place by attention rather than structure. Files, ledgers, boxes, all of it waiting to see whether it remained a system or became what it should have been years ago. Evidence. Thomas watched me come closer, not frightened, not hopeful, just tired. I said, "I need you to listen." He nodded once. "Good. I could work with that." Behind me, David said, "Do you need the pen?" "No." "Good." That was the most useful thing he'd said in 5 minutes. The tannoy crackled overhead. "Witness declaration available," the male voice said. "Please state failed return reference." I stopped at the edge of the threshold. The air there felt wrong. Not cold, not warm, administrative. Like standing in the doorway of an office where bad news has already been printed and only needs handing over. I said, "Thomas Omont." The warehouse lights dimmed. The task lamp sharpened. The voice said, "Reference incomplete." Margaret said, "Use the relation." I nodded. Thomas Omont, child of Eliza Omont, brother to Eleanor Omont and Elise Omont. The shutter groaned. The darkness beyond it shifted. One shelf at the back collapsed inwards soundlessly, like a thought being withdrawn. The tannoy clicked. "Return status?" I swallowed. This was the part. The part no one had said cleanly, because saying it cleanly would have made the rest of the family architecture impossible. I said, "Failed transfer." The lights flickered hard. Thomas shut his eyes. The voice said, "Clarify." Of course it did, always wanting the wound filed correctly. I said louder now because if I hesitated it would eat the edges. Thomas Omont died during an attempted transfer. Margaret made a sound behind me. I kept going. He was brought back through an active threshold point after the transfer failed. The warehouse trembled, not violently, structurally, metal racking ticking, bolts settling, the demonstration shutter behind us lifting an inch and dropping again. The voice said, "Receiving party." I looked at Thomas, then at Helen, then at the darkness beyond the half-open shutter. "No lawful receiving party." The tannoy hissed. Helen said sharply, "No." I ignored her. The return was made to the threshold site, not to the mother, not to the family, and not to the house as custodian. The lights over the sightboard came back on for 1 second, then blew again with a pop. David swore. Good sign. Helen came down another step. You cannot unmake relation by phrasing. Margaret said, "She's not unmaking relation, she's naming misdirection." Helen's voice sharpened. "The child belonged to the line." I turned on her then. "No, he belonged to his mother." Silence. Real silence. Even the printers seemed to hesitate. Helen's expression changed. Not much. Enough. There it was. The old crime under the newer language. Not just continuity, entitlement, the line, the account, the office. All of it built on the assumption that blood could be requisitioned if the wording was neat enough. I said, "And his mother did not receive him because what came back was not a child she could lawfully take." Thomas looked at me. I forced myself not to soften, not because he didn't deserve softness, because the room would use it, twist it, count it. The tannoy said, weaker now. "Unreceived return remains active unless placed." Margaret said, "Name the placement." I looked at her. "What?" "Name where he should have gone." I stared at her. "How am I supposed to know that?" She held my gaze. "Your witness." I nearly laughed in her face. Instead, I looked back at Thomas, at the pajamas, the bare feet, the impossible patience. And I understood something then that I should have understood years ago. This family had spent too long treating the dead like paperwork, and too little time treating them like people. Placement wasn't a site code, it wasn't a room, it wasn't a ledger shelf. It was where a child should be when adults stop using him to hold open their mistakes. I said slowly, he should have been buried as Thomas Omont, son of Eliza Omont. The warehouse lights steadied. I went on. He should have been named properly. A second shelf in the dark beyond the shutter folded inward and vanished. He should have been mourned properly. The task lamp burst, showering the workbench in sparks. David flinched back. The pen rolled off the bench and hit the floor. "Good," I said louder now because the whole building was listening. He should have been laid to rest as a child who died, not held as process, not carried as debt, not assigned as cost, and not transferred into any living structure. The tannoy screamed, not feedback, anger. The half-open shutter bucked on its track and began to descend. Thomas looked up sharply. Helen moved for the stairs. "Stop her!" Margaret snapped. David did for once without needing translation. He crossed the floor fast and caught Helen at the bottom of the stairs just as she tried to come down into the warehouse proper. Not dramatic, no wrestling, just a man planting himself in the way of a process that had used him long enough. "You stay there." Helen looked at his bound hand. "You're already counted," David said. "Then count this as refusal." That was good too. Very good. The shutter kept descending. Slow, heavy, final. The darkness beyond it thinned as it lowered, the shelves inside losing shape, labels dropping away, metal uprights turning to shadow and then to nothing. The tannoy crackled wildly. Placement incomplete, named recipient absent, continuity at risk. I said, "Good." Then, because I knew now what it feared, Thomas Omont is not to be received by family line, business structure, hotel site, or continuity proxy. Margaret inhaled sharply. The warehouse lights surged white. The voice snapped back, harsh and immediate. Then by whom? There it was. The demand underneath all of it. If not us, then who holds it? Who keeps the machine alive? Who agrees to carry what should have been buried? I looked at the descending shutter, at Thomas, at the last gap of dark. And I said the only honest thing left. Not by the living. Everything stopped. Not metaphorically. Stopped. The lights held, the tannoy cut dead. The printers upstairs fell silent in the same second. The shutter froze halfway down. Thomas stood perfectly still in the narrowing gap between warehouse and threshold. Then he looked at me, really looked, and for the first time since I'd seen him in the hotel corridor, he looked like a little boy who had been waiting far too long for adults to stop being clever. Margaret whispered, "Again." So I did. Thomas Omont died. The return failed. He was never lawfully received because he was never meant to be carried by the living after death. The shutter dropped another foot. Thomas blinked. His outline wavered. Helen said sharply now, genuinely frightened for the first time, "If you close it without receipt, he goes unfiled." I turned to her. "He's not a file." And that, more than anything, seemed to wound her. The shutter dropped again. Only a narrow space remained now between the floor and the steel slats. Thomas looked down at it, then back at me. "I was cold," he said. My throat closed. I said, "I know." No flourish, no speech, just that, because witness isn't performance. It's not poetry. It's standing in the room and not looking away. He nodded once, as if that had been the missing line all along. Then the warehouse door behind us slammed shut. Every light went out, and in the dark something small moved quickly across the concrete toward the closing threshold. In the dark, you hear truth faster. No lights, no faces, no useful distractions. Just sound, breath, and the shape of a room you already know too well. Something moved across the warehouse floor. Small, fast. Not the scrape of paper, not the drag of a box, not the metallic complaint of shutters or shelving. Feet, bare feet on concrete. Thomas. I knew it before the emergency lights kicked in. A thin red wash came on above the fire exit and turned the warehouse into a place halfway between a loading bay and a chapel no one had wanted to build. The shutter was almost closed now. A low gap remained at the bottom, no higher than a child could crawl through if he meant it. Thomas stood in front of it, not beyond, not inside the threshold, in front of it. That mattered. It mattered so much I nearly missed the second movement. Helen. She had slipped past David in the blackout. Not fully, not cleanly, but enough. She was no longer on the stairs. She was in the warehouse 3 paces from Thomas, cardigan grey in the red emergency light, one hand stretched toward him with the calm urgency of someone trying to retrieve a file before the cabinet locks. Margaret saw it the same moment I did. "No!" Helen didn't look at her. "Thomas," she said, and her voice had changed. Softer now, familiar. The tone of someone reaching for an old authority she had no right to use. "Come here." Thomas didn't move. That frightened her. "Good," she tried again. "You don't want to be left unplaced." I moved before I thought about it. Not toward Thomas, toward Helen, because that was the game, wasn't it? Always. Make the living reach for the child. Make relation do the work process can't complete on its own. I caught her wrist. Cold, not corpse cold, not dramatic, just the cold of paper left overnight in a locked office. She turned her head slowly and looked at my hand on her arm. Then at me. "That is unwise. Get away from him." "You don't understand the consequence." "No," I said, "you don't." Behind us, David's voice came hard through the dark. "Nell." I didn't look. "What?" "Don't let her touch him." "I know," Margaret said. "If Helen receives him, she'll count as continuity." There it was. Of course. The last route, not family, not business, not David. Helen, dead administrator, continuity after death, a bridge between process and person. If she took Thomas as named recipient, the system wouldn't die. It would simply close around her and continue elsewhere, cleaner than before. I tightened my grip on her wrist. "You don't get to keep him." Her expression sharpened. Keep him? Eleanor, don't be childish. I'm trying to place him. That word again. Always the tidy word. As if children were stationary. Thomas looked at her then. Not with fear. Not with love. Recognition, maybe? The kind children reserve for adults who have always been around and were never safe. Helen softened her voice further. You know me. Thomas said nothing. She took half a step forward. I blocked her. He knows you. That's not the same thing. The shutter dropped another inch, the metal edge now barely above Thomas's knees. The gap behind him had narrowed to a slit of darkness. The tannoy was dead, but the building still listened. I could feel it in the stillness, the held breath of systems waiting to see if someone would restore the pattern. Helen looked past me to Thomas. If this closes without receipt, you'll be nowhere, Thomas finally answered. I'm already nowhere. That landed on all of us. Margaret shut her eyes. David swore under his breath. Helen's face did something strange then. Not grief, not guilt, but irritation at the inefficiency of pain. That is precisely the problem, she said. I wanted to put her through the packing bench. Instead, I said, no, the problem is you keep confusing unresolved with available. She looked at me. For the first time, properly looked. Not as witness. Not as bloodline inconvenience. Not as a difficult woman in a corridor. As a threat. Good, she said very quietly. If he is not received, he will not be remembered correctly. I laughed once, a horrible sound in that red light. By you? No, by record. There is no difference to you, is there? That hit too. She pulled once against my grip, not to escape, to test whether I meant it. I did. Behind me, David said, Nell. Again that tone, working tone. I risked a glance. He was crouched by the workbench, red cord still around his wrist, feeling along the concrete floor with his clean hand. The pen, he said. What about it? It's gone. Of course it was. Of course the bloody pen had moved in the dark. Margaret turned sharply. Where? David looked toward the shutter. My stomach dropped. No. There, just visible in the red emergency spill, lay the black fountain pen on the concrete, a foot from Thomas's bare left foot. Close enough to matter. Close enough to count. Helen saw it too. Everything in her face tightened to purpose. There. I moved to block her line, but she was quicker than she looked. Not faster than a living woman. Faster than a decision that had been waiting 30 years. She twisted hard, slipped her wrist from my grip with a papery jerk, and lunged past me toward Thomas and the pen. David shouted. Margaret moved. I did too. But Thomas was the one who got there first. Not the pen. Helen. He stepped sideways into her path and looked up at her with the exhausted patience of a child who has finally understood which adult in the room keeps making things worse. No. One word. That was all. Helen stopped. Not because she wanted to, because she had to. The whole warehouse seemed to seize around the refusal. The shutter halted. The emergency light above us flickered. And Helen, standing over him with one hand half reached, looked suddenly less solid than she had on the stairs. Interesting. Very interesting. Margaret saw it too. He can refuse her. I said, why? Margaret answered without taking her eyes off Helen. Because she's not his relation. No. Better than that. I felt it click. Because she was never the recipient. Helen's head turned toward me, slow and sharp. I stepped closer. That's why you've been pushing family, marriage, business, signatory, continuity. Anything living. Anything lawful. Because you can administer the process, but you can't complete receipt. Thomas was still looking at her. Still blocking her. A little boy in blue pajamas stopping a dead woman with one word. Helen said, move. He didn't. I said, you can't take him. Her voice thinned. If he remains unplaced, the account remains open. Margaret said, only if the threshold stays active. David stood up now, empty-handed, eyes on the pen near Thomas's foot. And if it closes? No one answered. because we all knew. If the threshold closed and no one received Thomas into continuity, then the office lost its route. No ledger transfer, no business site, no dead administrator keeping the chain alive. Just a failed return finally named as failed. Helen looked at Thomas and changed tactics. Of course she did. "Thomas," she said softly, "if you come with me, it stops hurting." I felt the room tense. Not because we believed her. Because it was the right lie. The merciful lie. The one all bad systems use in the end. Come quietly and the pressure stops. Thomas looked at her, then at the pen, then at the narrowing gap beneath the shutter, and then, to my surprise, at me. Not for instruction, for witness. That was worse. That was heavier. Because now there was no script left, no clever wording, no administrative crack to exploit. Just a child asking, without asking, whether this was the moment adults failed him again. I said the only thing I could say honestly. "You don't have to go with her." Silence. Then Helen snapped, "You don't know what waits if he doesn't." I looked at her. "No, but neither do you." That was true. And she hated truth when it couldn't be filed. The shutter dropped another inch with a heavy metallic thud. The pen rolled once toward the gap. Thomas looked down at it. Helen moved again. Not a lunge this time. A reach. 2 fingers, quick and precise, toward the pen. David kicked it first. The black fountain pen skidded hard across the concrete, hit the warehouse leg of the workbench, and vanished into shadow underneath. Helen rounded on him with real fury now. "You stupid man." David straightened. Frequently, not tonight. That would have been funny in any other life. Thomas looked back at Helen, then said very quietly, "You left me in the room." Everything stopped, not the warehouse this time. Us. Helen did not answer. Could not, maybe. Thomas went on, same small voice, same terrible steadiness. "You said not to let my mother touch me." Margaret made a sound like something tearing. I stared at Helen. She didn't deny it. Of course she didn't. Because the worst things in this family were never quite lies, just instructions given in moments of panic and then buried under better nouns. Thomas said, "You said I had to wait." Helen's face had gone blank in the way people's faces do when memory arrives without permission. I said, "You kept him there." No response. Margaret whispered, "Helen." Helen finally spoke, but not to us, to Thomas. "You were unstable." That word, that filthy little office word. Thomas looked at her. I was 8. That did it. Whatever was left of the warehouse as process gave way then. The emergency light blew. The shutter slammed down another foot. The darkness behind it folded inward like paper burning from the edges. And Helen, neat cardigan, dry voice, all her decades of administrative certainty, flickered. Just once. Enough to show what death had left of her. Not a monster, not a ghost in the theatrical sense. A woman who had chosen system over mercy so many times she no longer knew the difference. Margaret said through her teeth, "Nell, finish it." I looked at Thomas. He was standing in front of the almost closed threshold, red-lit, barefoot, tired, and more himself than he had been all night. I said, "Thomas Omant was left in the threshold by Helen Vale after the failed return." The warehouse groaned. Helen turned on me. "No," I kept going. "He was not received by his mother. He was not received by the house. He was not received by the line. He was held in process by instruction and delay." The concrete under our feet gave a sharp crack like frost splitting. Thomas shut his eyes. The shutter dropped again. Only inches now. Only enough for shadow. I said louder, "The failed return is named, the delay is named, the instruction is named, the threshold is to close without transfer, without recipient, and without continuity." Helen screamed. Not loudly, not like a horror film, like paper tearing down the middle. And the last strip of darkness under the shutter began to pull at everything in the warehouse that did not belong to the living. The pull started with paper. Of course it did. Not people, not bodies, not anything dramatic enough to satisfy the wrong sort of listener. Paper. The nearest stack of delivery notes lifted first from the packing bench and slid across the concrete as if caught in a draft from a door none of us could see. Then labels. Then loose forms. Then the printed strips spilling from upstairs, skittering down the warehouse stairs and out across the floor in white streams. Every record the building had tried to make of us began moving toward the narrowing black line beneath the shutter. The threshold wanted its paperwork back. Good. Let it choke on it. Helen staggered once. Not forward, back. Her outline trembled at the edges like bad reception. Thomas did not move. He stood in front of the almost closed shutter with his hands at his sides while the paper rushed around his bare feet and vanished under the steel slat into the dark beyond. Margaret grabbed my arm. Don't let him go with it. I looked at her. What does that mean? It means if he steps back into the route before it seals, the return remains active. That was useful information, delivered far too late, which was very much her style. David had his back to the workbench now, bracing himself against the pull as site maps and printed job sheets whipped past his legs. Nell, he said, voice tight, what exactly are we holding on to? Thomas, I said. In practical terms. In practical terms, I don't know. Excellent. The black fountain pen shot out from under the workbench then, skidding across the floor toward the shutter like it had remembered where it belonged. Helen saw it and moved. Even half fading, she moved with purpose, not toward Thomas this time, toward the pen. Because of course that was the truest thing about her in the end. Not the child, not the grief, not the family, the instrument, the means of keeping record alive. I lunged and stamped on it, hard. The nib snapped with a tiny metallic crack. Black ink bled across the concrete in a sudden branching stain. Helen made a sound then. A real one. Not anger, not fear, loss. Good. I ground my heel into it. Enough. The pull intensified. Forms lifted from the warehouse floor and slapped themselves flat against the shutter before being dragged under. Labels peeled from boxes. The visitor log from reception came skating through the open warehouse door like a trapped animal and vanished into the gap. Upstairs, something heavy toppled. A filing cabinet, maybe. Or a printer finally giving up the will to serve. Thomas looked down at the broken pen, then at me, then at Helen. And for the first time, there was no process in his face at all. Only a child deciding whether to trust the adults currently available, which is one of the bleakest things I know. Helen reached for him again, not quickly, carefully, as if she still believed tone could fix what action had ruined. Thomas, she said. And now there was strain in it. If you stay there, you won't be placed. He looked at her. I don't want your place. That hit harder than any scream could have. Helen stopped. The pull caught her cardigan then. Just the hem at first. A twitch toward the shutter, then more. The sleeves flattening against her arms as if wind were blowing through her from behind. She looked down. For the first time since I'd known her, alive, dead, or administratively undead, she looked uncertain. Margaret saw it too. She's being counted. I looked at her. What? Margaret's voice was flat with the horror of recognizing a rule too late. She maintained continuity after death. If the threshold closes without transfer, anything still acting as process gets pulled back. Helen turned sharply toward her. You said... I said many things. Margaret snapped, most of them to survive you. That was the first decent line she'd had in years. The shutter dropped another inch. Now only a hand's breadth remained between steel and floor. The darkness beyond no longer looked like shelves, no archive, no route, just depth. The sort of depth old wells have when you know the water is there but can't see it. Thomas looked at the gap, then at me. I was cold, he said again. Not complaint, not accusation, just fact. I stepped toward him before anyone could stop me. Margaret said my name sharply. I ignored her. If witness means anything, it means not leaving the child alone at the door. I stopped just short of touching him. Didn't risk it, didn't need to. I know, I said. He nodded once, then looked past me at Margaret, not angry, not forgiving, just looking. Margaret broke under that gaze in a way she hadn't under anything else all night. "I'm sorry," she said. No grand speech, no explanation, no defense built from old fear. Just that. Thomas listened, then turned his head slightly as if hearing something none of us could. The pull under the shutter deepened. Helen took one involuntary step toward it, then another. Her shoes scraped the concrete. She dug in absurdly as if dead women could still find traction through willpower and sensible footwear. "This is incorrect," she said. No one answered. She looked at David. "You are signatory. Stop this." David folded his arms. "No." She looked at me. "You are witness. Amend the record." "No." She looked at Margaret. "You opened it." Margaret held her gaze. "Yes," she said, "and now I'm closing it." That landed. Not because it was noble, because it was late. And late truth still counts if it arrives before the door shuts. The pull caught Helen properly then. Her outline jerked toward the gap, not bodily but structurally, like pages being drawn from a file. Her edges blurred, her cardigan flattened. One hand shot out and caught the leg of the packing bench. For half a second she held. Then the bench itself screeched across the concrete 6 inches toward the shutter. David swore and grabbed it. I nearly told him to let it go, but he was already committed, boots planted, shoulders locked. "Don't be helpful," I said. He bared his teeth. "Bit late for character notes." "Fair." Thomas looked at Helen. "You said waiting was safer." Helen's face changed. Again, not guilt exactly. Recognition of wording returned. "I was trying to preserve—" "No," he said, "just that. No." And the bench leg slipped from her hand. Helen went down onto one knee, dragged forward by something that no longer cared for her titles. The shutter gap narrowed again. A few more inches and it would be done. She looked up at me then. Really looked. No office voice, no cardigan authority, no procedural calm. Just a woman who had spent too long mistaking management for mercy. "If this closes," she said, "the account doesn't vanish." I said, "I know. It will still exist. I know. You'll still remember." That one nearly landed. Nearly. I looked at Thomas, at the pajamas, the bare feet, the small, tired face, then back at her. "Yes," I said. "That's called grief." And that, more than anything, seemed to finish her. Because grief is useless to systems. It doesn't scale, it doesn't transfer. It doesn't produce continuity. It just sits in the living and refuses to become process. The pull took her hands next. Then her voice. Not all at once. It thinned, snagged, and tore like tape being stripped from old paper. Her last shape was not monstrous. That would have been easier. It was administrative to the end, a woman reaching for order and finding only the consequences of her own filing. Then she was gone. Not exploded. Not banished. Taken back through the gap under the shutter in strips of shadow and paper and the memory of a cardigan sleeve. Silence followed. Not complete. The building still creaked. Somewhere upstairs, a final printer spat one lonely page and died. But the active listening had stopped. The site no longer felt like it was waiting to see what we'd choose. It had chosen. Or been denied the right. Thomas was still there. The shutter now less than 2 inches from the floor. No route left. No shelves. No archive. Just the last impossible space between here and wherever failed things go when no one keeps them open. He looked at me, then at Margaret, then at David, which surprised us both. David said carefully, like a man approaching a frightened dog he knows belongs to someone else, "I'm not signing anything." Thomas almost smiled. Almost. Good. Then he looked back at me. "What happens now?" "There are questions no one should ask a stranger. That was one of them." I said the only true thing I had. "I don't know." He considered that, then nodded, as if uncertainty was finally preferable to the lies. The shutter dropped another fraction. A breath of dark air touched the concrete. Thomas stepped back once, not into the root, into the edge of the closing line. Margaret made a sound. I held up one hand to stop her, because I understood then, or thought I did. This wasn't receipt. This wasn't transfer. This was departure, not ours to organise, only ours to witness. Thomas looked at me one last time, not grateful, not tragic, just tired. Then he said, "Tell Elise I waited." And the shutter closed. Hard, final, steel to concrete. No gap, no dark, no shelves, no root. The warehouse lights came back on in one brutal fluorescent snap. Ordinary again. Racking, pallets, workbench, broken pen under my shoe. David with one hand on the packing bench. Margaret standing like someone had removed a scaffold from inside her and forgotten to replace it. And on the concrete in front of the shutter where Thomas had been, lay one small white label. I bent and picked it up. Typed in clean black capitals, returned/received. I stared at it. David came to stand beside me. What does that mean? I looked at the shutter, at the ordinary steel, the ordinary bolts, the ordinary business we had very nearly turned into a ledger for the dead. Then I looked at the label again, and from somewhere upstairs, in the admin office where Helen had sat behind the desk and waited for signatures, a phone began to ring.